Have you ever been so tired after a long shift that every task feels like it's happening in slow motion? That was exactly my state of mind when I pulled into a desolate gas station at 4:30 in the morning. I had just finished a grueling overnight shift at the hospital and was looking forward to nothing more than a warm meal and my bed. But I didn't know that this pit stop would be far from ordinary. The gas station was eerily quiet. You know the type, one of those rural stations with a massive, empty parking lot that echoes every sound. The only other car there was a blue sedan parked a few pumps down. I barely registered it. All I could think about was getting home. As I stepped out of my car to fill the tank, I noticed a man by the sedan. He was tall, wearing a weathered jacket, and seemed to have one of those unsettling, too familiar smiles. I nodded politely, hoping he'd ignore me. But no, he didn't. Instead, he walked toward me, his hands in his pockets, smiling as if we were old friends. "I want to show you a funny trick," he said casually. Now, I've worked enough night shifts to know when something feels off. But for some reason, maybe exhaustion, I hesitated before responding. "What's the trick?" I asked, already regretting it. He raised his hand and began doing that old, childish gag where you pretend to pull your finger off with the other hand. He kept looking back and forth between his hands and me, a smirk plastered on his face. It was bizarre. I faked a polite laugh, hoping he'd take the hint and leave me alone. He didn't. The air felt heavier as he stood there, repeating the same stupid trick over and over. My tank clicked, signaling it was full, and I almost sighed with relief. I quickly hung up the nozzle, muttered, "Have a good night," and bolted for the station to pay. When I came back outside, the man was gone. His car was still parked at the pump, but there was no sign of him. Something about the whole interaction made my skin crawl. I hurried back to my car, glancing over my shoulder as I got in. My paranoia kicked in, so I checked the back seat. Empty. I locked the doors and drove off, keeping an eye on my mirrors the entire way home. The road was deserted, and I didn't see any headlights behind me. I finally began to relax as I pulled into my parents' driveway, eager to eat and crash. Quietly, I unlocked the door using the spare key they always kept hidden outside and stepped inside. The house was silent, dark. My parents were heavy sleepers, so I wasn't worried about waking them. I made a beeline for the kitchen, set my food on the table, and sat down to eat. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the front door unlocking and then closing. My heart stopped. I froze mid-bite, listening. "Mom? Dad?" I called out, but there was no answer. No footsteps. Just silence. Gripped by fear, I crept toward the hallway to check the front door. It was closed, but something wasn't right. My chest tightened as I realized the spare key wasn't where it should be. Panicked, I ran upstairs to my parents' bedroom. They stirred awake as I barged in, barely able to get the words out. "Someone's in the house." My dad jumped out of bed, grabbing the closest thing to a weapon, a golf club, and ran downstairs. I followed close behind. He checked every room, turning on every light, but we didn't see anyone. I thought maybe I imagined it until we checked under the dining room table. There he was, the man from the gas station, crouched like a wild animal, staring up at us with those same unnerving eyes. I screamed and my dad lunged at him, swinging the club. The man fought back, but my dad held his ground. My mom and I joined in, doing whatever we could to fend him off. It was chaos. Finally, the intruder broke free and bolted out the door, disappearing into the night. We called the police immediately. They arrived quickly and stayed parked in our driveway for the rest of the night, but the man was gone. The next day, my dad changed every lock on the house. To this day, I can't shake the guilt. I brought that man to my family's home because I wasn't paying attention at the gas station. I still wonder, how long had he been watching me? And how did I not notice him following me all the way back? If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Never let your guard down, even in the most mundane places, because you never know who's watching. There's something about driving at night that feels strangely peaceful, don't you think? The empty roads, the soft hum of the engine, it's like the world is asleep, and for a while, you're the only one awake. That's exactly how I felt on that particular night as I set off for a long road trip to visit my brother in Florida. It was 4 a.m., and the hunger pangs were starting to kick in. I had skipped breakfast earlier because, honestly, who's hungry at 2 a.m. when you've barely managed to drag yourself out of bed? But now, with miles of highway stretching ahead, I needed to stop. When I saw a sign for a Wendy's just off the interstate, I didn't hesitate. I took the exit, following the dimly lit road into what felt like the middle of nowhere. The parking lot was deserted except for one lone car parked in the far corner. The building's lights were on, but something about the place seemed off. Still, I pulled into the drive-thru and waited. Nothing. I called out, "Hello?" into the speaker, but no one answered. Frustrated, I pulled out my phone and Googled the location. It wasn't even open yet. It wouldn't be for another 2 hours. Great. Just as I was about to back up and leave, I heard a knock on my window. The sudden noise made me jump out of my skin. I turned to see a man standing just outside my driver's side window, smiling. His clothes were slightly dirty, and his face looked tired, almost worn out. He gestured for me to lower the window. Against my better judgment, I cracked it just enough to hear him. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he said. "My car's dead over there, and I've got jumper cables in the trunk. Can you give me a hand?" I hesitated. My gut told me to say no, but the thought of leaving someone stranded didn't sit right with me. I nodded reluctantly and pulled my car into position beside his. The man opened his trunk, pulling out a set of jumper cables, and motioned for me to pop my hood. As he hooked up the cables, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The parking lot was too quiet. The air felt heavy, like something was about to happen. "All right," he said, stepping back. "Start your car." I turned the key, and my engine roared to life. He gave me a thumbs up and walked to his car. But then he didn't get in. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started pacing back and forth, speaking in low tones. Something was wrong. "What's going on?" I called out, leaning slightly out of my window. "Just a minute," he said without looking at me. That's when I heard it. The rumble of engines. 2 pickup trucks speeding into the parking lot from opposite sides. My stomach dropped. They screeched to a halt, blocking my car from both the front and back. It was a trap. The man's demeanor changed instantly. Gone was the polite, desperate act. Now he was grinning, his eyes cold and calculating. My pulse raced as I realized the gravity of the situation. I was trapped, alone, and outnumbered. I acted on pure instinct. Shutting off my engine, I grabbed my keys and bolted from the car, running toward the woods that bordered the lot. I could hear their shouts behind me, angry, frustrated, but also mocking. They were toying with me, enjoying the chase. The forest was pitch black. Branches scratched at my face and arms as I stumbled through the underbrush. My breath came in ragged gasps, and every step felt like it echoed into the void. I found a spot behind a fallen tree and crouched down, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. The men were close. I could hear them shouting in Spanish, their voices angry and hurried. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The voices came closer, and I braced myself for the worst. But then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they started to fade. The men were moving away. For a moment, I let myself believe I was safe. That is, until I heard my car alarm blaring in the distance. My stomach sank. They were at my car, and all of my belongings, my suitcase, electronics, everything, were inside. I waited until the alarm stopped and the silence returned. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way back to the edge of the parking lot. The trucks were gone, and so was the man. Only my car remained, a shattered window glaring like a broken tooth. Everything was gone. They had taken my suitcase, my bags, even the spare change in the cup holder. I was devastated, but more than anything, I was grateful to be alive. The police arrived about an hour later after I called from a nearby gas station. They listened to my story and promised to look into it, but their expressions told me not to get my hopes up. The car left in the lot? Fake plates. The trucks? No plates at all. They'd planned every detail, knowing it would make them impossible to trace. To this day, I don't stop for anyone at night, no matter how desperate they seem. Sometimes, the kind thing to do isn't worth risking your life. And every time I pass a deserted parking lot, I can't help but wonder how many others have fallen into the same trap. There's a peculiar type of tension that settles in during long road trips at night. It's not quite fear, but an odd awareness of how isolated you are. No traffic, no noise, just you, your car, and endless stretches of highway. That's how I felt on a 15-hour overnight drive through the East Coast, somewhere between a mild sense of freedom and a gnawing unease. Around 2 a.m., I hit the inevitable wall. Restlessness mixed with an urgent need to use the bathroom. I'd been scanning for rest stop signs for miles, and when I finally spotted one, I almost sighed with relief. The small, dimly lit area didn't look like much. A simple building for restrooms and a few parking spaces. It was eerily quiet with no trucks or other cars around. At first glance, it seemed perfect for a quick stop. As I pulled in, I parked close to the restroom and noticed a single car at the far end of the lot. Its windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't see inside. I didn't think much of it. People nap in their cars all the time, right? The restroom building itself was dimly lit, and the faint hum of a flickering fluorescent bulb greeted me as I stepped inside. The air was cold, and the space reeked of bleach mixed with something sour. But that wasn't what sent a shiver down my spine. Standing in the corner of the room, facing the wall, was a man. At first, I thought he was using the urinal, but as I walked further in, I realized he wasn't facing it. He was just standing there, motionless, head down, his arms limp at his sides. His presence was unsettling, like he didn't belong there, or anywhere for that matter. I hesitated, debating whether I should say something, but something about him felt wrong. My gut screamed at me to leave, but I really needed to use the bathroom. So I swallowed my unease and headed into one of the stalls, closing the door behind me. Inside the stall, I could barely think straight. The silence was suffocating, and I couldn't bring myself to do what I'd come to do. My senses were hyper-alert, and every tiny sound, the creak of a pipe, the shuffle of my own feet, seemed amplified. And then the sound I'd been dreading, movement. I froze, holding my breath. Footsteps echoed softly across the tiled floor, slow and deliberate. They stopped just outside my stall. Through the narrow gap in the door, I saw a pair of shoes. Scuffed old sneakers. They didn't move. Whoever it was just stood there, silent and unmoving. My heart raced, and my mind went blank. I considered calling out, but something told me to stay quiet. After what felt like an eternity, the shoes finally turned and walked away. I heard the faint creak of the restroom door swinging shut. Relieved, but still on edge, I decided I'd had enough. I flushed, though I hadn't actually used the bathroom, and stepped out of the stall. The restroom was empty, or so it seemed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My steps quickened as I exited the building and headed toward my car. That's when I saw him again. The man was standing near my car, staring at it. At me. The dim light of the parking lot cast shadows over his face. But his eyes glinted with something I couldn't name. Fear? Malice? I didn't wait to find out. I jumped into my car, locking the doors in one fluid motion, and started the engine. As I backed out of the parking lot, he began walking toward me, his pace slow but deliberate. I didn't stick around to see what he wanted. The adrenaline rush kept me awake for the next hour. But as time passed, I began to convince myself that maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe he was just a strange man passing through. Creepy, sure, but harmless. 20 minutes later, I spotted another rest stop. This one looked identical to the first, small, dimly lit, and empty. But this time, there were no other cars in the lot. I debated skipping it altogether, but decided to make it quick. I couldn't hold it any longer. The restroom was silent, but this time I felt slightly more at ease. I finished my business quickly and washed my hands, eager to get back on the road. Then I heard the door creak open. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I glanced in the mirror. I didn't see anyone, but I could hear the faint sound of footsteps. My chest tightened. I turned, scanning the room, but it seemed empty. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Then I saw them. Under the door of the stall nearest to me, I saw shoes, scuffed old sneakers. The same ones from earlier. My blood ran cold. He had followed me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I darted out of the restroom and sprinted to my car, my heart pounding. As I started the engine, I saw movement in the restroom doorway. He was there watching me again. His face was emotionless, and his head tilted slightly, like he was studying me. I sped out of the parking lot, barely able to keep my hands steady on the wheel. My heart didn't stop racing until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a brightly lit gas station and parked in full view of a security camera. I stayed there until sunrise. To this day, I don't know what that man wanted or how far he would have gone, but the thought of him standing in that restroom waiting still haunts me. If I've learned anything from that night, it's this: even the most mundane places can hide unimaginable dangers.